So to now onto today's webinar, cutting the carbon impact of transport. This is a really key area. I think we've started to get to grips with energy, might not be perfect yet. And transport, in my eyes, is the next big hurdle for us all. Not only because it involves a complete change in technology and can involve large-scale investment, but it also involves quite a lot of behaviour change, and some of that is a bit uncomfortable, but things that we must start to embrace. So I'm delighted that we've got some brilliant speakers this morning who are going to talk about this topic. Beatrice Sampson has joined us from the Energy Savings Trust, where she's Fleet Support Executive. Graeme Banister is the Account Director at Mobilityways. And then Nathan Bland is not only a FM Contracts Manager and Support Manager at Compare the Market, but importantly, he's a member of the Green Team there and helps to deliver the Investors in the Environment programme at Compare the Market. So with no further ado, I would like to ask Beatrice to give us her presentation.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Camilla. Let's see if this works this time. Okay.
Well done, that's looking good.
All good, all good, okay. So thanks very much for that introduction, and hi everyone. I'm Beatrice Sampson from the Fleet Advice team at Energy Saving Trust. So we're an independent organisation set on tackling the climate crisis. And within my team, we provide advice to fleets on how to reduce and decarbonise fleet and business travel emissions. So in my presentation today, we're just going to quickly go over an introduction into reducing business emissions from travel. Firstly, looking at your own fleet, so that's the fleet that's owned, whether purchased or leased, and run by the organisation. And then secondly, we will have a look at the grey fleet, so that's business travel that staff undertake in their private vehicles. The methods for tackling both of these areas are quite different, and I've summarised the sort of 3 key points in each area that we'll go over here. But the real first step for both parts is to make sure that you have an understanding of what your vehicles are doing at the moment. I've tried to keep acronyms to a minimum, so we've got a couple on this slide, but if there's only one that you remember throughout this, throughout the presentation, try to remember battery electric vehicles as BEVs, because I will probably use the two interchangeably. So we'll start by looking at your own fleet. And the first thing really is collecting data to understand what the fleet is doing now. If this isn't already being done, then really the amount of fuel and the number of miles travelled by each vehicle in the fleet needs to be accurately recorded, accurately and regularly recorded, and at the very least. So depending on the size of your fleet, it might also be a good idea for you to install telemetry, which will give a more accurate daily energy use then as well. So knowing the fuel and mileage means that you can then calculate accurate energy efficiency for each vehicle, so that's your MPG. And once you have that, it might show where you've got particularly efficient or inefficient drivers or rounds or vehicles. It gives you areas that you can investigate to see where improvements can be made. So if you've got, for example, any needless idling or any sort of anomalies within the data, but without knowing what your vehicles are doing, you can't see what anomalies might need investigating. And then also having accurate fuel, mileage and efficiency data will also make transitioning to electric vehicles much easier. So if you know what energy or mileage your petrol and diesel vehicles are doing on a daily basis, then you'll know whether a battery electric vehicle can do the job on a single charge, or if you'd need any daytime top-ups. And you can also see then what size battery you might need. You might not need the largest battery available with the vehicle. And if you can have a smaller battery, that will save on costs and on materials. With this, you can also work out the amount of energy required for charging, and from that, the power required of your charge points, which we'll get to in a couple of slides. So just coming on to the transition to battery electric vehicles. as a method for decarbonising. So when we're talking about cars and vans and we're talking about decarbonising, really battery electric is the best way to go. And this is because electric vehicles are far more efficient in terms of their energy use. They're simpler vehicles, which means they can keep going for longer. There's less bits to break. And you can also get around a sort of 75 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions immediately from the switch. They have no emissions at the tailpipe, which if you're in an area where air pollution is a particular concern, battery electric vehicles are really the only option that's widely available at the moment with no emissions at the tailpipe. But also the emissions that are produced, so these are from producing the electricity to charge the vehicles, those will continue to reduce as the grid decarbonises without needing to make any sort of changes to the vehicles themselves. The market for electric vehicles is really dynamic. Even going back the last 2-3 years, there's been a huge increase in the numbers of vehicles available. The technologies are improving and the single charge ranges have increased. So this is just sort of a summary of the types of availability that you can get within the car and van fleets in terms of battery sizes and ranges. And electric vehicles these days do come in all sort of shapes and sizes in terms of cars and all weight categories in the vans. The areas, there are still some areas that are lacking development, that are struggling in terms of electrification. Mainly these are sort of complex machinery, off-road machinery, but also things like gritters and more complex larger vehicles. But also four-wheel drive pickup trucks with towing capacity is a sort of potentially niche but large category that at the moment we just haven't got the electric vehicle availability, that we're still sort of waiting for development in those areas. But if you're only running cars and vans, then there should be something that will be able to do most, if not all, of the work needed. So this is just to give a small illustration of the costs when we talk about electric vehicles. For comparing costs, we would always recommend looking at a whole life cost or a total cost of ownership approach. And this just takes into account the purchase or the lease cost, but also energy, maintenance, tax, clean air zone charges, all of the elements of cost over the period of ownership of the vehicle. I've got a quick example here. These numbers are really just for illustration. They will change, the energy costs will change on a daily basis depending on what the vehicle's doing and what the energy costs are at that time. But this is really just to illustrate that you can see that the purchase cost is higher for the electric vehicle. And this would also have a higher leasing cost if we were looking at a leasing framework. But because the energy costs are quite a bit lower, when we put all of the lifetime costs together, you can see that these two, the petrol and the electric cars, both come out roughly equal in terms of costs. And this is the whole life cost over an 8-year period of ownership. And we do find that electric vehicles can be cost comparable with petrol and diesel. They can be quite a bit cheaper. They can also be quite a bit more expensive. And it really depends on the models that are chosen, things like the energy efficiency of the vehicle being replaced. If you're replacing a vehicle that constantly works in a stop-start environment in cities, which is where electric vehicles really come into their own, then there's potentially quite a bit of efficiency saving and monetary saving to be made on switching to electric vehicles. But if you're constantly running up and down the country on the motorways, where petrol vehicles will be more efficient, but electric vehicles will struggle a bit more, then the cost effectiveness of the electric vehicle might struggle a little bit in those situations. But also the annual mileage is one of the most important bits. So the more cost effective, the higher the annual mileage, the more cost effective the electric vehicle will be, because there's more opportunity to save on those reduced energy costs. And it might be that over your whole fleet, some vehicles may have increased costs, but then other might have lower costs so that they can balance out. But just the main point here is to look at this from a whole life cost perspective. So the final point within your own fleet, and this is almost sort of the more important and perhaps difficult thing to consider is how to charge the vehicles. So really, we would recommend having the charging infrastructure in place before getting hold of the vehicles, because otherwise you'll need to rely on the public charging network, which will be more expensive to use in the long run, but also depending on where you are in the country, may or may not be easily accessible. So in most instances, unless you're running really high daily mileage and needing that daytime charging, or if you've got sort of 100 kilowatt hour plus batteries, so we're talking about heavy commercials here rather than cars and vans, then normally we would say that standard 7.4 kilowatt AC chargers with overnight charging are absolutely fine. There's no real need for a faster charge if you've got a long overnight period of time during which the vehicles can be charged. The big question perhaps is where to locate the charging infrastructure. So have you got a depot, or will you need to be able to install charge points at employees' homes? And that can get a little complicated in terms of have they got off-street parking that can be used for the works vehicle or not. And then if you do have a base where the charging infrastructure can be installed, that really needs to be incorporated into the wider picture for the buildings. So for example, if you're also transitioning the heating system to electric as well, or if there's potential to install solar PV at the site, the fleet cannot be addressed in isolation. It needs to be part of a holistic approach to energy consumption at the site. So moving on to part 2. And we'll have a look at the grey fleet and staff business travel. So as with the own fleet, the first real step is data collection. So you need to be knowing, at least recording the mileage and the vehicle emission information so that you know accurately how much the grey fleet is emitting, and also identifying if you've got any particularly highly emitting grey fleet vehicles that are being used within the grey fleet, and perhaps considering whether or not you want to be allowing those vehicles. So the first step in tackling grey fleet emissions is to implement a robust travel hierarchy. And this involves, really, it's a fundamental change from retrospective authorization to pre-authorization of trips. It means employees firstly have to question the need for travel in the first place, and then also guiding through to the lowest emission option possible. So it starts with promoting non-travel options, digital communication. Great example is what we're doing right now. But then also walking and cycling to local meetings where possible, and for longer distances, public transport should be encouraged. Of course, that is within reason, like depending on what is available within your area. And then if car travel is the only option, then there are options that the employer can provide in order to provide lower emission options than using staff's own vehicles. So the first option is pool cars. These are owned and managed by the employer, and ideally we would say these should be battery electric. If you can achieve a high utilization, so we tend to look at around 10 to 12,000 miles a year per vehicle, they can be cost comparable to a grey fleet reimbursement rate of 45p a mile. The single biggest thing that will give the success of a pool car fleet is that high utilization. If they're not being used sufficiently, then that's quite a high cost asset that's potentially just sitting in a car park waiting to be used. So the pool cars, really, the employees need to want to drive the pool cars, so they need to be easy to book, nice to drive, and kept clean. And there are options that this can be outsourced if it's not an area that you have any experience with. So you could also implement a system whereby the employee has to prove that a pool car wasn't available in order to pre-authorize a grey fleet claim. And this is just one of those methods for ensuring that pool cars are the first option when employees have to think about road options for travel. And often we also find that when employees are needing to book a car, then the employee might combine several trips, and that will reduce staff travel mileage altogether and just improve that efficiency and reduce time spent on the road as well. Similarly, car clubs are short-term sort of by the hour, by the mile rentals set up and managed by external companies. So there would need to be one available in your area. But if you are a large employer and can provide that base usage case to encourage one of the external companies to come and implement a car club in your area, that can also have huge community benefits in terms of making them accessible to the public as well. And then hire cars are just longer term daily rentals. And these could be quite useful if you could have 100% battery electric pool fleet, but then very occasionally have a long journey that the employee wouldn't be comfortable in an electric car doing in an electric car. That's where hire cars can provide that flexibility. And then finally, just another option is you could implement a zero emission salary sacrifice car scheme. This is where the employee can lease a car through the employer, and there are lower benefit in kind tax rates on zero emission rated cars. And then if you have all of these different options available to staff so that they don't have to use their own vehicles, then it's also possible to start implementing emissions caps on the grey fleet. And take the years sort of now until 2030, you could implement a system whereby every year or every couple of years, the allowable grey fleet vehicle cap emissions reduce, so that you're reducing the emissions within the remaining vehicles. So unfortunately, decarbonising grey fleet isn't that easy. It can be an area that's quite resistant to change. No one single method will work on its own, but it's about putting in place incremental steps that together will add up. So access to active and lower emission transport really need to be made easier, so that it's not necessarily the easiest option for employees to just get in their own car and drive off. In terms of walking and cycling, for example, looking at, are there safe routes that employees can take, and if not, is the employer able to improve access, improve lighting, things like this? Can the employer make bicycles available to staff? Are staff aware of the public transport options around? It's about improving that confidence within your employees that they can use other transport options and they know what other transport options are around. And then there will be some overlap with the commuter as well with this. So, for example, if you put in place a pool car fleet, that might enable some employees to be able to use active or public transport to get to work if they no longer need their car for work. So communicating, really just to finish, communicating with your employees is key here, and working out what makes active and public transport inaccessible and working with employees in a supportive and collaborative way. And this is an area where leading by example can also have a huge impact. So just to summarise, for decarbonising both the own fleet and the grey fleet, the first step really is to just understand what the fleets are doing, how much energy they're using, and how much greenhouse gas emissions they're generating. So for your own fleet, start by transitioning where battery electric vehicles are best suited, and don't leave the charging infrastructure as an afterthought. And then for the staff travel, implementing a travel hierarchy is key, and by instituting lots of different measures and providing zero emission forms of travel, it is possible to reduce the emissions from grey fleet travel. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions, and there's my email if you'd like to get in touch.
I'll just take myself off mute. Thank you, Beatrice. That was brilliant. So as I said, we'll save questions till the end, but certainly some things resonated there. I recognise that travel hierarchy. I think that appears in the IIE travel plan template, which members will be aware of. And I think that also I kind of recognise the slight, I know that members often grown a bit when I asked them to gather data about the fuel type and car size of their grey fleet mileage, their grey fleet, but it is an important area, and certainly for carbon footprinting, that data is required, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, and now I'm going to share my screen again so that Graeme can go through his presentation. So I'll now, hopefully you can all see that, can you? And I will now, if Graeme, you would like to take over, that would be great.
Perfect. Thanks, Camilla. Firstly, for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks to Beatrice for sharing your insights on decarbonising own fleet and grey fleet vehicles, and also a nice lead into commuting from your incremental changes slide. I'm Graeme Banister. I'm a sector director at Mobilityways. And Mobilityways, we work primarily with large organisations to tackle commuting emissions. Our mission is to make zero carbon commuting a reality. Next slide. So why commuting? As you can see on the slide, commuting accounts for 5% of the UK's overall carbon footprint. It is significant. In the fleet sector that Beatrice outlined, most company cars and vans are leased. There are around 5 million leased vehicles in the UK. So that means approximately 15% of the UK's total vehicle car park is directly funded by companies, which therefore on the other side means that around 85% are not and are privately owned. Outside of London, the private car dominates as the commuting mode of choice. And on top of this, most private car commuting is single occupancy. The impact of this is that there are many millions of vehicles on the road each day for the sole purpose of getting to and from work. It is the most inefficient use of vehicles that we have. So this is particularly relevant to large organisations given the requirements to achieve net zero. Commuting is a scope 3 emission, meaning it needs to be measured and plans put in place to reduce and demonstrate progress against these plans, i.e. provide accurate reporting to shareholders and customers, and indeed employees. We will come to Mobilityways framework for measuring, reducing and reporting on commuting emissions shortly. Next slide. As the slide highlights, this is not just about net zero. There are other benefits to be had from tackling commuting emissions. Financial, cost of living obviously being prevalent as a consequence of what's happened over the last few years with pandemic, health and well-being, and there's operational benefits to be had. These elements will be brought to life in a client video that will be played, hopefully, at the end of this presentation. Next slide. Just a little bit about why Mobilityways. We work with an impressive list of clients, public and private, so at government level, universities, hospitals and private sector. Most of our activity is UK based, though that we have the capability to, our capability permits deployment in other markets. Next slide. Okay, so onto the framework itself. So, I mean, it follows quite nicely with how Beatrice was talking about own fleet and grey fleet. There's a large part of measurement, but we have a framework here, which is measure, reduce, report. And I think before diving into some of the key elements, just some context. I've kind of mentioned that Mobilityways works with large employers, but it's important to highlight that the framework and the underlying processes and tasks are applicable to any size of organisation. If you represent an SME today, and let's remember SMEs account for 60% of the UK's workforce, what I'm about to cover is relevant regardless of company size and structure. Next slide. So there was, obviously you can see from the previous slide, there was lots of different component parts, but I'm just going to tackle probably 5 of them, which I think are most relevant. And again, ones where actually the essence of it can be tackled in a smaller organisation. It doesn't need a Mobilityways to deliver it. So the first part is travel surveys. So following the theme, it's important to get into the nuts and bolts of how an organisation is travelling. Travel surveys are pretty standard in terms of delivering them. We have an efficient tool for delivering that for large companies. But a travel survey gets you to understand how people get to work. It provides some snapshot information in terms of potentially the emissions and the real-time view of how the workforce are getting to the place of work, to the office. Next slide. What we've been able to do as a combination with travel surveys is to create a standardized methodology whereby for an organization we can provide an emissions calculator. An emissions calculation, we actually have an estimate calculator that's free of charge. It's available on the website. So you can plug in, if you know the approximate percentages of how your employees are traveling to the site, you can draw out your own ACEL score, as we call it. And actually, we also have within, as a resource on our website, an ACEL map, which allows you to then compare your score versus the scores within the region. A lot of this data is used, we take a lot of this stuff from ONS, but overlaid onto that is some clever bits behind the scene to kind of get to this point. And the reason we've got this calculation is, you'll see obviously it aligns quite closely to what we'll commonly see from our electrical appliances. It's to kind of help people ascertain where they might be as they take this journey towards net zero. And again, particularly aligning that with larger organizations, they can understand where they are today, and given that they have a time frame to hit net zero, where commuting emissions is concerned at a point in time, it helps to give them a position in terms of how far they have to go to get to this point. And to help on that regard, the next slide is scoping. So travel survey will tell you how people are traveling. That can be then converted into a calculation and a scoring. The scoping is a really important part, which we've devised, which helps to actually understand the potential to move to sustainable travel options. So this is what we do here is we'll typically work with full postcode data. So we'll take that from the employer, and then we'll do a mapping exercise of all of those employees to highlight to the organization the propensity or the ability for people to move to sustainable transport. And that in itself will derive another ACEL calculation. So now you're in a place where you've measured not only how it's happening, but looking at where is the potential for you to move people to more sustainable modes of transport. We use a number of variables and business rules within the tool to come up with this thing. So obviously, clearly, if you live 20, where perhaps it's going to take somebody more than twice the time it would take them on the car to go by bus or by train, is going to be difficult to change that person's behaviour to make that jump. But what we can do on top of that is to show them, here are densities of employees where lift sharing could be an option, and that is one of our core products. And in fact, Mobilityways, the foundations of the business are built on lift share, which has been running for almost 20 years. So scoping's a really fantastic tool, and like I say, it's not insurmountable that a smaller organization couldn't use free-to-use tools such as Google Maps to try to actually have a picture of how their employees might get to work in a different way. Next slide. Scoping is an important tool for us because it also allows us to generate personal travel plans. Personal travel plans in themselves aren't a tool that in itself will derive masses of behavioural change. There's a lot more activity that needs to be done to get people to change their ways, but it's a fantastic guide point for an employee to understand the modes of transport which they could take to get to work. We delivered, I think, in the last financial year, 150,000 travel plans to clients, and this is built in. Obviously, oftentimes within large organisations, the chance to talk to employees, colleagues about travel is around breaks, coffees, canteens, we put up a stand. Well, actually, this speaks directly and individually to each employee, delivered into their inbox, and it allows them to see what the opportunities are for trying a different, for embracing modal shift. So again, like I say, it can be done in a smaller organisation. We just have a tool that allows it to be done for very large volumes of employees. Like, for example, we work with Heathrow, there's 70,000 employees. Next slide. And lift share. So I mentioned lift share. It is a foundation of the business. It is a reduction tool. And Mobilityways has, in some respects, been formed out of the pandemic, and where the business, shared mobility was a slightly awkward arrangement a couple of years ago. But what's Mobilityways all about? It's about tackling commuter emissions and driving down to zero. Lift share can play a fantastic role, and actually for some organisations, it's a great way of getting to that place where some phones going off, typical, of getting to a place where an organisation and colleagues can see, actually there's a density of people who live quite close to me, and therefore here is an option for me to lift share. Lift share is available. We have closed community groups for large organisations, but it's a free to use resource as well. So even if you are a smaller organisation, you can set something up on lift share. Your colleagues can put on that they're doing this trip, they can connect up. So it sits there as an available resource to just help to streamline that process of getting people to share lifts, and as a consequence of sharing lifts, saving CO2, saving mileage, and saving cash. Next slide, please, Camilla. Well, on the next one. Now, hopefully.
Oh, yes. Here we go with I'm going to start sharing this, and hopefully this.
Commuters is one of the main contributors to the poor air quality in the country. Parking is very, very limited, which means we've got to find different ways to attract and retain staff. And from scoping data, we find out that there is somebody who commutes from Edinburgh, which could be a challenge, but we also find out the average distance that most staff commute from, and that there is a lot of staff that can find alternative ways to travel rather than single occupancy vehicles.
With travel, it's more about promoting other options to influence behaviour change to try and encourage those more sustainable behaviours. So that might look like things like improving showering facilities, so that when you do cycle in, it's a more positive experience, and there's less friction in that process.
We've been able to put together things like personal travel plans for staff so that they can find out that there are different ways. They don't have to bring their car.
Trust are leading on signing a healthy climate prescription, which is something that's been signed by lots of doctors already, but it's sending a message to COP27 and to our government and others about what we as health professionals see needs to be done in terms of climate change.
So they've been able to give us our ACEL score, which tells us what our commuter emission levels are, so that we can set targets to achieve what we need to by the time we need to achieve it. Without the personal travel plans that we've been able to link to our car parking policy, we would have been left with just approaching staff face-to-face. Personal travel plans online enables us to reach a lot more staff than what we could do face-to-face.
If we can have apps like Lift Share, for example, which make the process of finding a lift into the hospital easier for that individual, then that's sort of the tactic that we try and use to try and approach sustainable travel.
Mobilityways has helped us to build a business case for sustainable travel. It's helped us with building a business case for a new shuttle bus that's going to be launched later in the year for our hospital in Weston. It's helped us build a business case for our new on-demand shuttle service that we've launched for staff overnight. So we find that our scales for pandemic was lower than it is now, which it was good to find that out because it gives us the evidence we need to convince the decision makers that we need to put the alternatives in place so that the way people commute to this hospital is sustainable.
Yeah, brilliant. Bit laggy. I just put in the chat the the link to that video, which sits on YouTube on our channel there. So there's plenty of other videos as well about activity that we do. But hopefully that gave you a good flavour of kind of, like I said, the benefits of not just tackling this from a net zero perspective, but actually where it gets you in terms of financial well-being, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that was really it.
Excellent. Now I just need to get off this screen, which is always the joy with. Now, is that looking right? Am I back onto the right?
Yep, all done.
Right slides? Excellent. Graeme, thank you very much. That was fantastic. And I really, Lift Share is fantastic. And I know that some of my colleagues at PECT have used it to get their lifts into work. And it's such a simple thing to do. And I think that the fact that it's managed by a sort of third-party platform makes it work. It's a really useful tool. So I'd advise everyone to have a look at that. And we might talk about at the end about other tools that are available as well, other sort of programs. But for now, I am going to ask Nathan to unmute himself and tell us a bit about some of the things I think that we've just heard about will be echoed in what Nathan's going to tell us, but about what they've been doing at Compare the Market. So if I can hand over to you, Nathan, are you there?
Yep. Thanks, Camilla. Thanks, Graeme. Thanks, Beatrice, for your input so far. As Camilla alluded to there, Compare the Market have been on a bit of a journey. We've been working with PECT for a number of years now, and last year achieved the Transport Champion award with PECT. Things that we've done to improve our colleague choices in terms of changing their transport mode. We've installed better, more well lit, fully covered bike storage in our facilities. We've also got the staff showers available to every single colleague. We are also going through a process of improving those as well. So we're trying to make those a better experience for our colleagues. In our London office, we do have a bike servicing and repair pop-up that comes in every week. So if colleagues do need their bikes attending to, they can have that done whilst they're in the office. We also have an established cycle to work scheme, which during the COVID years, we actually increased the value of, because everyone was being told to get out and exercise more, and the availability, lead time, etc., and cost of bikes was going up. So we actually increased that during COVID, and we've increased it further since then as well, because we've had a good uptake in that. So give you an idea, we've had sort of 30 to 40 new entrants year over year on that. So our employees are taking up that program. October last year, we also introduced a scheme where colleagues can purchase via payroll, via the salary sacrifice scheme that Beatrice mentioned earlier, to purchase an electric vehicle. To date, we've had 22 vehicles ordered, or colleagues take up that program. So that's since October. And we expect that to keep going, probably another 20 to 30 this year, we think. We have replaced our charging points in and around the office. We did have some units that were probably about 10 years old. So we were one of the first adapters, or adopters, I should say, of EV charging points. The ones we have installed give us live feed, live data. You can even know how long a particular car has been charging, and what, more importantly, from my finance colleagues' perspective, how much it's costing us. Currently, that is free to colleagues. We don't have any plans to change it, but never say never, depends on the uptake. In terms of our pool car fleet, we didn't really have a big one to begin with. And we did have an arrangement with a company for a number of vehicles. We've actually replaced those now. We've managed to reduce it down to one hybrid car. A couple of points there. One main driver was the drop-off in people coming to the office since reopening the facilities and working from home habits, which has driven the demand for vehicle and colleague travel, business travel down. We do run bus shuttles. So our Peterborough office is on the outskirts of Peterborough, but we do have good links to London through the rail network. We operate a shuttle pickup drop-off every day, morning and evening, to allow our colleagues from London and Peterborough to travel vice versa. That carries probably around about 42 passengers a week at the moment. It used to do more, but as I alluded to earlier, the COVID pandemic has impacted ways of working for our colleagues. One other thing we do as well is we use Slack, which is a communication tool. We have a number of channels on there. So one for electric vehicle drivers. They have one so they can keep people informed that their cars have finished charging, they're going to free up the chargers, for example. We also use it for the environmental piece as well, looking for ideas, schemes and things like that. We also have a channel, picking up one of the points that Graeme mentioned, around people's choices of transport. So it sounds simple, such as putting a bus timetable on the system, or even the cycle route from the station to the office. It's a simple thing to do, but people do appreciate it. And we've found that Slack is a great communication tool to try to get people on board and communicate more around the transport choices they make.
Excellent. Next slide.
Yep. So a few other challenges that we've had, probably not unfamiliar to most of you that own an electric vehicle. Some people do complain that the chargers aren't charging their vehicles as fast as they expected. So we've had to educate our employees on how electric vehicles charge. So I think, Beatrice, you mentioned it. It's actually the car that dictates the charge speed. Challenge on availability. I mentioned it a minute ago. We use Slack. It's a self-policing channel, as I said. So when people are complaining, there's been a run on the charging units. Someone's been keeping their car there for 3-4 hours. Someone might just ping a note to saying, come on, is it time to move on? And then there is the availability to all of us actually at the moment of the EV. So that's been impacted by the shortage of precious metals, for example. So that's associated with global manufacturing. We did have a bit of a challenge with the hybrid pool car. People were complaining about the way it operated. So it was really an education program again, talking around and educating and communicating to people. Something, Graeme, you mentioned earlier was the availability of vehicles. We do sometimes have a challenge with the vehicle, but we give them alternatives. We do have another works vehicle that they can utilize. And as I mentioned earlier, Slack, brilliant platform for communication. It's immediate for responses, and it's a great tool for sharing ideas throughout the organization. I think for us, the biggest thing is communication across all our colleague base is key, and making people's decisions easy is the other that I would take away from this today. And that's me done.
Brilliant. Well,
Okay.
I will stop sharing my screen so that we can have some questions answered. Certainly, I was on the panel. I didn't play a part. I was sort of comparing the panel for the Sustainable Champion Award, and the judges really liked the idea of that, the Slack channel and getting that communication going, and people and inter-peer learning and information sharing. So it's a really great idea. So let me just have a quick look at what questions we have had up. So in answer to will we share the slides? Yes, we will. Jenny has asked, could someone recommend sources to provide reliable information on two-way BEV batteries? I've been told they can be used as batteries for your solar PV system at home, the office, and would like to find out more. Does anybody have anybody answer that one?
I'm not sure I can give the most insight into it. I'm assuming that's the sort of vehicle to grid ideas. As far as I'm aware, I think the only car that can do two-way charging is the Nissan Leaf, but I don't know whether it's actually warranted, whether it invalidates the warranty. It's not a hugely developed area at the moment, but it's being worked on, I think is my understanding.
Yes, I will try and find out more about that. I had a friend who actually worked in that sector about how they were going to increasingly use car batteries as a form of storage, and the switch that would facilitate that. Can't remember who it was. Her. She swapped jobs in between whilst telling, but within a close time framework. It was either Kiwi Power or Pivot Power, and one of those was doing exactly that. So and Jen has suggested that Robert Llewellyn's Fully Charged YouTube channel is great for all things EV and renewables. So that's a good thing to share. Thanks for that, Jen. I wanted to ask if there are, because there were grants available, I think the workplace charging schemes. Anybody know those are still available, those grants? That can sometimes facilitate getting those charging points installed. Christian, you've come into view.
Yeah, no, most of those grants now sadly have gone for both workplace, but certainly from a home charging standpoint, they've been removed.
And are they available for the workplace charging scheme?
Well, they kind of moved the goalpost. They changed the wording. There are still grants available, but it depends then if you're charging the end user, physically charging them to charge the car. If you're giving it free electricity into the car, that's fine, and there's ways around that. But it's become a bit of a sort of grey area at the moment, and you have to move away from maybe EV and just looking more for infrastructure. The actual infrastructure of getting the power to the site is where there might be grants available, and that's probably the biggest challenge with EV. Full stop.
Is the charging infrastructure? Yeah,
and the DNO. It doesn't matter for a lot of the people listening, watching this sort of webinar. It's not a monetary issue. It is the DNO and the challenges that geographically around the country the DNOs have in getting power. So, for example, you're mentioning some of the sites where if you've got 100 sort of car parking bay and you want to put the chargers in, and everybody in the business is prepared to pay for that, it's been signed off. It's a real challenge to get the power there to charge those 100 bays. It's a huge challenge.
Right. Okay. So still another bit of a hurdle there for the rollout.
There's ways around it though. There are, like what we try to do, looking at battery storage and different ways of generating, because the existing business of whatever the organization is, it would go pop if all 100 charging bays at say 7.3 kilowatts were being charged. That's a hell of a lot of power. So it's getting its way around that, and that's where the government have started to help with the national grid. But yeah,
and probably needs quite a lot of knowledgeable support, I suspect.
Yeah, because as I said, most businesses that we deal with, the finance director, the owner, sign it off and say, yeah, okay, we've got the funds for this. Linking back to what you said about most businesses now, if not all, they recognize they have to come on the journey of net zero and doing all they can to at least lower their carbon footprint, if not taking it to zero. But the challenge is it's the national grid.
Okay, yeah, Thank you. I wonder if some of members who are on the call, or anyone who's on the call, has got other good examples of what's been introduced at work. I like the idea of the budget, the sort of giving people a mileage budget, which I know we have a lot of members of the programme who are in the veterinary sector, and they have to go out and do visits. But I know one of my, in a bid to try and reduce their overall mileage, one of my members gave each person a mileage budget that they had to try and stick to throughout the year. And they were, and then it was like a cap and exchange mechanism. So they capped it, and then anybody who looked like they were going over the mileage had to see if they could borrow some miles from somebody who'd been terribly efficient. But are there other ideas or things that people have introduced that they'd like to share? Always danger. No, sadly, we do have a member who's from Northampton General Hospital. I know she's got lots of fantastic things going on, but sadly, I know she registered, but she's obviously been caught unable to attend. But she has lots of examples. And Jen, you're sharing that WWF have a carbon budget for employees' travel. And Graeme, you shared something. What have you shared there?
I was just responding to a question about template example for a staff travel survey.
Oh, brilliant.
Obviously, on the basics that you need to kind of get to a point where you understand how people are traveling, I've just put into the chat there. I mean, obviously we can, with some of our clients, we'll have heavily bespoke travel surveys, which will go into a lot more detail about appetite for other services and how might they like how they might like to be communicated around in terms of like personal travel plans, or having a lift share account straight away created for them. So, but I think if it's about just getting to that point of kind of baselining, and what today's certainly highlighted again for me is kind of like, it's all about measurement, whether it be own fleet, grey fleet, or commuting. That's the starting point really there in terms of getting yourself to a point of understanding how people are travelling to the office.
Yeah, and certainly within the members' resources section of the IIE website, there is a travel questionnaire, a travel survey. Whether it actually asks for specifics on distances, I can't remember, but you can adapt it to your own purpose. So it's a useful tool, and as I say, can be tweaked to be useful. To be specific for your organization. Did anybody, I wondered if either Graeme or Beatrice, if you know about larger vehicles, about some of the alternative fuels and the developments there, or specific sources of information which are good for those who have larger vehicles in their fleet.
I think the best thing is to pass you on to one of my colleagues who's our HGV specialist. But I know, so there is limited availability in terms of electric vehicles when we're talking about larger vehicles. The most developed area is probably refuse collection vehicles, so bin lorries. If there are any local authorities on the call. In terms of the other things that we sort of hear about are things like hydrogen, which has potential, but is currently not. There aren't any hydrogen vehicles widely available at the moment, and the refueling infrastructure is not there. I think there's only about 10 hydrogen stations within the UK at the moment. The other option that we hear a lot about is HVO, so hydrotreated vegetable oil. If you are looking to go down this route, you do need to be aware that it is a biofuel, and you need to be really sort of on the ball, questioning where is the fuel coming from. Is it like HVO is usually using waste materials? You really need to question at every stage of the production process. Are those genuine wastes? Where are they coming from? Where are the other materials that are being used to make the HVO? So you do need hydrogen in order to process and make HVO. Where is that coming from? Where are the emissions from producing that coming from? So it's quite a complicated production process. But there are other options out there, and it might be that for, if we're looking at cars and vans, there isn't really an excuse to not go electric. But if you are looking at off-road machinery and options where there are electrification, then it might be that looking at HVO and biofuels could offer an option. But you need to be really careful and really aware of where the materials are coming from.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I see I've noticed there's I mean, Jen again has suggested that there were a couple of e-bike. I think having e-bikes that companies can share is another thing that's developing, and you're seeing happening more and more. That employees can share, sorry, sort of a fleet of e-bikes. And Maxine has asked if there are government support for companies that want to introduce an EV salary. I mean, certainly there is a way to purchase EVs through salary sacrifice, which is something that Compare the Market have introduced, and I'm sure others who are on the call as well. With that, I would like to say thank you very much to Beatrice, Graeme and Nathan for your contributions. It was really brilliant. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the topic. I will share their emails with you as well when I send out the slides and the link